Hi pals and welcome to a new video. I'm Kate and today I'm talking about my favourite reads of 2025. I'm filming this a little bit in advance of it going up, but so far this year I've read, I think it's like 73 books. The ones I have to talk about today are the best of the best and I'm really excited to do this video. A couple of things it's worth mentioning, these are in no particular order, but I have grouped them into categories like classics, non-fiction, and some poetry. Most of the books on this list are new to me. I read them for the first time in 2025. There are maybe like 2 to 3 rereads. I did read some perennial favourites this year like Barbara Pym and Jane Austen. But when you're thinking of your best reads of the year, it is usually the new ones that stand out as favourites. Let's go ahead and get started with my favourite classics of the year. First up on my list of 2025 favourites is Ants on Gentlemen by P.G. Wodehouse. I read this in June and this is the 15th and final Jeeves and Wooster novel, and finishing this felt like such a momentous occasion because the Jeeves and Wooster series of novels are some of my favourite books I think ever written. I've had such a wonderful time reading this. I started the series I think in 2017 and I really took my time with it and was quite deliberate and slow in terms of working my way through them. One of the things that you'll know if you read a lot of P.G. Wodehouse, especially Jeeves and Wooster, is that what he does is he really hones and refines his craft throughout the Jeeves and Wooster novels, and you get to like Right Ho Jeeves, and by that point he has essentially written the perfect Wodehouse novel, and then he goes ahead and repeats that formula for the rest of them. You might think that would get boring, but it really doesn't because P.G. Wodehouse is a genius and his writing is just utter perfection. It's always slightly tricky trying to figure out where to rank books that are part of a series because my love of this is definitely impacted by the previous 14 novels. In Ants on Gentlemen, Bertie Wooster retreats to a quiet life in the country on the advice of his doctor, and essentially hijinks follow on from there. It's really hard to summarise the plots of P.G. Wodehouse novels. You do sound slightly crazed when you try to do it. It's very much about the characters in this, the friendships that really make them kind of like so moving and why they resonate with so many people. There is that beautiful quote about P.G. Wodehouse's novels being kind of the eternal English summer. But these have brought me so much joy, and finishing this was really a highlight of the year, so I knew that it had to be in there. I highly recommend everybody read P.G. Wodehouse. The next book is quite similar and it is E.F. Benson's Map and Lucia novels. I will keep this really brief because I've spoken about this a few times on the channel. This was published in the 30s and is set in the village of Tilling and follows 2 rather formidable women, Elizabeth Mapp and Lucia Lucas. The novel is really about their kind of social rivalry, the one-upmanship that goes on in this village. This is a very sardonic yet gentle and playful and joyful novel. The only thing about this is I could really kick myself for not reading it sooner. This is also part of a series, and I think that this is the 4th novel in the series, but it's generally the one that most people begin with, including myself. I have gone back and read the first in the series, Queen Lucia, which I also really enjoyed, but it didn't quite hit the same heights as this one. But E.F. Benson has become an absolute new favourite of mine, and I can't wait to kind of finish the series for this and get to more of his classic crime novels and his ghost stories as well. Next up is George Orwell's debut novel, Burmese Days. I did a whole review video on this one, so I will keep this brief. This is set in the Burmese town of Chaktagar in the 1920s, and it follows Flory, who is a English timber merchant. The heart of the novel is a European club in that town, which all of the British kind of officials frequent. This is really heavily influenced by George Orwell's time in Burma. If you've read some of his non-fiction essays, you will recognise a lot that is kind of included in this novel. The writing in this is really quite beautiful, especially on the natural kind of world within Burma. It is a little bit old-fashioned, which is, I think, really fascinating when you think of George Orwell's later works. It's very Edwardian in style, which is probably why I liked it so much. I thoroughly enjoyed this one, and I thought about it a lot since I read it over summer. Next up is also a novel that I have a whole review video on, and it is Parade's End by Ford Madox Ford. A novel that is so close to being absolutely perfect but doesn't quite make it. It is, however, still a favourite of the year. To my mind, this is the best novel of the First World War that I've read and probably ever will read. It follows Christopher Tietjens, a upper-class English gentleman who enlists to serve in the First World War. It's mainly a novel, I'd say, about the collapse of Edwardian society, about the psychological impact of the First World War. This was written in the 1920s, but I have heard it described as the last Victorian novel, which rings very true to me. Now we're on to my favourite American classic of the year, and it is American Pastoral by Philip Roth. In short, I thought that this was truly exceptional. This is one of the Philip Roth novels that has his alter ego Nathan Zuckerman in, but this one follows a character called the Swede, who is basically the embodiment of the American dream. He's like blonde-haired, blue-eyed, high school athlete who becomes a very successful businessman. He's also meant to be a good man. He's really decent and kind, but his life is derailed by an event in the novel. This is set in the late 1960s in a time period of American history that I think is really fascinating. This was a favourite because the depth in this novel and the writing are truly rare in terms of how exceptional they are. I want to head to I Married a Communist next. I'm going to aim to read that in January or February, but Philip Roth, I have a feeling, is a new favourite of mine. Next on the list is a Victorian classic, and it is Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. If I had to pick one favourite of the year, it would be this. The plot to this one is quite hard to summarise, but it centres around the inheritance of a very large fortune. The plot is also completely, wildly implausible, but also absolutely brilliant. This is one of the most atmospheric novels I've ever read. Victorian London is just evoked so well in this. This is one of my favourite Dickens and my favourite read of the year because of the absolutely incredible cast of characters in this. Some of my favourite Dickens characters, like Jenny Wren, Lizzie Hexam, Bradley Headstone, are all found in Our Mutual Friend. I listened to this one on audiobook over summer, and it just has the most perfect blend of atmosphere, plot, character, emotion, humour, just like utter perfection. So if there had to be one, my favourite kind of read of 2025, it would definitely be Our Mutual Friend. Right, on to the last classic I have on the list, and it is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. I read this back in January, and I think I said that I would be really surprised if this didn't end up as my favourite novel of the year. I didn't quite factor in Philip Roth or Charles Dickens in that. This is, however, still very much deserving of its place on this list. This is an epic western in its sweep. It follows a real-life historical gang of scalpers working on the the Texas-Mexico border in the mid-19th century. And Blood Meridian is I think a masterpiece. It's like Shakespeare meets the King James version of the Bible meets Herman Melville is what it's always described of, and I agree with all three of those. You will hear this very often when this book is spoken about. There is an overwhelming and kind of unrelenting amount of violence in this, which I know won't be for everybody. I do think it's worth the payoff because, like I said, really do think it's a masterpiece. There's a character in this called the Kid, and he has this amazing kind of slow burn, like moral arc in this. There's also a character called the Judge, which is just the most brilliant literary creation. This was really a high point of the year, and I'm so glad I headed to this, and very glad that I stuck with it despite finding the violence quite off-putting. Right, next up is a couple of new releases that I really enjoyed this year. The first is The Mayor by Ingrid Hampshire. I read this over summer. This won the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. This is a fictionalized account of a female concentration camp guard who worked in Germany and Poland during the Second World War. And the novel essentially asks, what would it take for you to become that person? I think what I really liked about this is that there were a few easy outs that the author could have taken to make this a little bit neater, to kind of make the moral message kind of more simplistic, but she doesn't take any of those out, and she actually gives this a depth to it that I thought was brilliantly done. The horror in this is really quite breathtaking, but it's not gratuitous. The tone in this is also really well judged. It's not preaching or manipulating you for like an emotional reaction. She really lets the characters, some of whom are absolutely reprehensible, speak for themselves. My only real criticism of this, and I said it in my reading wrap up, is that the dialogue between characters, between the husband and wife in this, and between a few of the friends, I think it's a little bit clunky. That being said, I think that the subject matter and the execution really do kind of raise this up to being a favourite of the year. I would really recommend this to people, especially people who are into historical fiction. The second new release I wanted to talk about is The Dutch House by Ann Patchett. New-ish. This was released about 6 years ago, but that is still quite new for me. I read this in February, I think, and this had been on my bookcase waiting to be read for about 5 years. I really did myself a disservice there because I thoroughly enjoyed this, and this is one of the novels that when I originally read it, I thought it was very good, and it's only increased in my estimations over the course of the year. This is very much the American family saga, which I think I'm growing into as a genre. This follows a family called the Conroys. The father of that family buys essentially the grandest house in a Philadelphia suburb called the Dutch House, and you follow the family, mainly the brother and sister. It hasn't escaped my notice that both of my favourite new releases are historical fiction. The writing in this I thought was very good. The sense of place and time I loved. The characters, Beav and Danny, the brother and sister, their actions and motivations felt very true to life. And like I said, this one has really stayed with me. I should read more Ann Patchett. I should make that a kind of goal for next year. But my second kind of favourite newish release of the year, The Dutch House. Right, let's move on to my favourite crime novels of the year. I have 2 classic crime novels and 1 novel from the 90s. The first is The Daughter of Time by Josephine Tey. This is part of Josephine Tey's Inspector Grant series, and in this he is bedbound and turns his attention to solving the 400-year-old mystery of the princes in the Tower who were supposedly killed by Richard III. This has the most unique and ingenious premise and has some really interesting things to say about how history is written, how historical myths come to be accepted. It actually deals with some really complex themes that you don't generally find in a crime novel. The mystery is great. There's a great cast of characters in this. I just thoroughly enjoyed this, and I really must, a lot like Ann Patchett, read some more Josephine Tey. Right, we're on to a very exciting point because the next one is my favourite Agatha Christie of the year. 2025 has been the year of Miss Marple, and it is A Murder is Announced. This is set in the village of Chipping Cleghorn, and as the novel opens, a murder is announced in the local newspaper, the date and the time that it will happen. A group of neighbours gathers on that same date, and naturally a murder does happen. The mystery in this one is elaborate, but it's really well constructed, and all makes, I think, perfect sense when you get the big reveal. There are some standout Agatha Christie characters in this. This is one of Christie's post-war novels, and it's really focused on how the war has changed kind of English village life. I can't speak more highly about this one. I will say that this year I also reread And Then There Were None, Endless Night, and The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. Some of my favourite Christie novels. If I had read any of those for the first time, they would probably be here in place of A Murder is Announced, but this is just a very thorough, solid mystery. Miss Marple is fab in this. I have a real thing for village murders, but this one was the surprise of the year and I cannot recommend it more. The third crime book on the list is the first book that I read in 2025, and it is An Instance of the Finger Post by Ian Pears. This is a historical murder mystery set in Oxford in the 17th century, a time and a place I absolutely adore. In this, a servant is accused of murder. She's accused of poisoning a fellow of New College, Oxford. The genius of this is that it's split into 4 kind of narrative accounts, all from eyewitnesses of the events surrounding the murder. And all 4 narrators of those accounts are the most like unreliable, pompous, deceitful characters. They're just absolutely wonderful. One is a Catholic Venetian, one is a cryptographer, one is the son of a historical figure accused of treason. This has such a playfulness to it, but it's also grounded in like a really thorough understanding of Oxford and of the time period. Like I said, this is enormously fun, it is brilliantly written, and it really evokes the atmosphere of post-Civil War England. My only downside to this is that a new plot element is introduced towards the end of the novel that I felt just detracted from the mystery, and actually could have been a whole novel in and of itself, but all in all, this is still definitely a favourite of mine. Right, I've had a little pick-me-up coffee break, and now we're on to 2 of my favourite poetry collections of the year. The first one I'm absolutely not going to do justice to because you could spend like months or years indeed studying William Blake, but the first is Songs of Innocence and Experience by William Blake. This is a very late addition to the list because I read this a few days ago. I have previously read a fair few of the poems in this in like anthologies, so I was familiar with some of them, but this absolutely blew me away. One of the things that I loved about this was the English folklore behind it. A lot of the poems in this are inspired by ballads or psalms or English folk songs, and you really get that rhythm when reading it. This is William Blake, so the poems are obviously absolutely impeccable, but the sheer sense of imagination and myth and like faith and just genius behind these, it's really hard to encapsulate in a short review. what I'd love to do next year is listen to this. I always with poetry, if possible, like to read, then listen to it and then read it again. So I will definitely come back to this, and I'd also love to come back to more William Blake. I do have plans next year to get to some big poetry that I haven't read in quite a while, like Paradise Lost, which is a big inspiration on this, I think. So yes, I will come back to William Blake over the course of the year, but I absolutely adored this, and this is such a beautiful thing to read over Christmas as well. So really one of my highlights of the year. And my second poetry favourite of the year is The Penny Dropping by Helen Farish. I read this over the summer, and this is a verse sequence poetry collection. If you asked me what that meant, I couldn't 100% tell you. Though what I can say is that this is the account of the start of a relationship through to its end, and through the poems it really reads like a story. The writing in this is beautiful. The poems are so well constructed and really do like resonate. This one has really stayed with me, and I have bought another one of her earlier poetry collections. Right, we're into the last category now, and it is non-fiction, and I have 3 books to talk about. The first one is Agent Zigzag by Ben Macintyre. I read this back in April, I think, and this is one of those books where real life is stranger than fiction. Agent Zigzag is the real life account of a double agent during the Second World War called Eddie Chapman. He was recruited by German intelligence at the beginning of the Second World War, and he later goes on to spy for British intelligence. This is full of twists and turns and the most improbable like plot twists. Like I said, truth very often stranger than fiction. I'm a fan of Ben Macintyre's work. They're very much in that popular history vein where they read like novels, but I do think that they can be enormously good fun if you're in the mood for them. The Spy and the Traitor, which is about a Soviet double agent during the Cold War, remains my favourite, but I had an absolutely great time with this one and would highly recommend. And second on the list is the Grasmere and Elle Foxton journals by Dorothy Wordsworth. These are the journals written by Dorothy Wordsworth while she was living at Dove Cottage, mainly living at Dove Cottage in Grasmere, which is in the Lake District, from 1798 to 1803. The journals are really simple and honest and moving, and it's just the most fascinating account of her life living with William Wordsworth. They're very much at the beginning of his career, so they're living kind of not in poverty, but they're just about getting by in Dove Cottage. Samuel Taylor Coleridge is living nearby. They're constantly worried about him. What I will say is that Dorothy Wordsworth can sometimes be a little bit like melodramatic, but I guess you would expect that from kind of key characters within the Romantic movement. Okay, so we're on to the last book on the list, which is a very short history book, and it is Athelstan by Tom Holland. Tom Holland is one of my favourite historians, and Athelstan is my favourite ever King of England, so naturally this one did make the list. This is part of the Penguin Monarch series, and this is the first in that series because Athelstan is the first King of England. He was an Anglo-Saxon king and reigned from 924 to 939. Do I have that right? Yep. And part of the reason why I love this so much is because his reign marks the formation of England as we now know it. He's also the grandson of Alfred the Great. And so in this book, you get this absolutely terrific sweep of British history that is really so fundamental to understanding the country as we kind of like now know it. This is really well written and you can get through it in a couple of hours. What I will say is that there wasn't too much in here that I hadn't come across before, but it's a really great kind of little introduction if you've never encountered Athelstan or that kind of period of Anglo-Saxon history before. Right, that's it for my favourite reads of the year. It's been a terrific reading year and I've read some absolute crackers, I do have to say. As ever, I would love to hear from you in the comments if you've read any of these and what your favourite books of the year are. I hope you've all had a lovely, lovely Christmas, and I will wish you all a happy new year ahead of my first video of the new year. So see you all soon. Bye!